close, I can't see. Giving away the punchlines. I write lots of notes, yeah. All right. I'm going to be talking about the path that it's taken us to get to Cake 3. It's not a super technical talk, but it's a little bit more technical than James. I'm not going to show any code because there's too much to show in a 30-minute timeline. Jose's going to be doing most of the cool code showing. I'm just going to be talking about what we've done and how we did it and what's going to come up and what the plans for all the future are. So the talk should really be called the somewhat long road to Cake 3. It's been a couple years in the making, and a lot of people have been asking, when is it going to come? When is it going to come? I get an email probably every other month or every month. When is it going to come? And I have to tell people, I don't know. I do this in my evenings and my weekends, and so does everyone else. So it'll be done when it's done, and if you want to make it come faster, you can come and help. Here's all the issues, and here's how to do a pull request, and that's that. And it's not just me and Jose. There's people all over the world hacking away on this thing. So before we get too far into Cake 3, there was another Cake 3. It came out in 2009. The code ended up becoming a different framework, and I'm not talking about that code. We decided to start from scratch, and yeah, so it's a very different Cake 3 than the one that was out in 2009 that some people were talking about. So before I talk about all of the gory details, just some quick numbers. The first commit to Cake 3 was done on May 24th, 2012 by Juan Basso. When Jose and I and Juan were talking in IRC, we were like, we really should start this. And we knew we had to switch, and the first things we wanted to do was support namespaces because we were going to 5.3 plus. We didn't have a target at that point. And so Juan was like, well, I'm going to write a script to go and take all the code out and put namespaces in and change all the class names. And that's where it began. So there was a pull request with every file changed in the entire framework. And that's how it went down. And then from there, it's been a series of many pull requests. One of the things we changed for Cake 3 was that all of the core feature development was done as pull requests. This was for a couple of reasons. One, it was to try and encourage people to get involved. And the other one was that the main core team is distributed across however many, I think there's like 10 of us, and I think there's 8 time zones, which makes communication has to be totally asynchronous. So the only way to do it is like we either email diffs, which is kind of ghetto, or janky. So what we do is everything is done through a pull request, and this has actually worked out really well. And it's ended up with us having over 6,000 commits sitting on the branch, coming soon. And those commits have come from 20 people. I think we're at 21, maybe 22 now. So it's taken a while. But during those 2 years, a lot of life events have happened. Jose got married. He moved to Denmark. I had a child. Andy had a child. Admad, whose real name I still don't know. So if you know it, please let me know. Because I talk to him every single day. It's not Mark, no. And so there's been a lot of life events that have, interrupted software development, but we've powered through and we're almost done. Also, one of the other reasons it's taken so long is at the beginning we talked and we decided that it was going to be impossible to write all the documentation at the end. That's a common programmer thing was, we'll write the docs at the end, it'll be fine. But we knew that was a terrible decision. When we'd worked on 1.3 and when we worked on 2.0, in 1.3 we left the docs to the end and it was a horrific train wreck. We got to a beta and then it was like 3 weeks of writing documentation nonstop, and we forgot things and things were left undocumented for years. So this time around, every time we built a feature or made a breaking change, there was someone remembered in the pull request to say, you should really write the documentation for that. And so the end result is that currently the beta is fully documented, both in the API and the book documentation is completely up to date. So if you read the 3.0 book, the documentation, and you find an issue and it looks like a problem, we should fix it because those are the docs that we're going to have when we flip the switch. And they're as up to date and accurate as we can make them. The translations are a little bit behind. Part of the reason for that is the English docs are moving really quickly, and the translation communities are having a little bit of trouble keeping up. But the English docs are correct. So Cake 3 brings a few items of big news. hopefully for us and hopefully for you. The first one is that we're targeting 5.4, and the framework is fully using Composer. One of the things that when we started the development on Cake 3, we said we're going to target 5.4. And people were like, no, that's crazy. It's never going to work. It'll be too soon. And then last week, they end-of-lifed PHP 5.3. If you didn't hear it, PHP 5.3 is at end of life. So we were right on. Caught the train right on time. So we targeted 5.4. I recommend 5.5 because the opcode caching is a little bit better. And the other thing we did is we required a couple additional extensions. This was for two reasons. One, we were handling multi-byte internally written in PHP. If you didn't have the MB string extension, we would fall back to PHP code. And for internationalization, there are really powerful tools built into the language that we weren't kind of capitalizing on. And we wanted to leverage those tools to give you better tools. So the two extensions that we're requiring are MB string and the INTL extension, the Intel extension. These give you multi-byte, so everything is Unicode. The entire CakePHP core is Unicode aware. And additionally, through the Intel extension, everything is localized. All of the core classes localize themselves based on your default locale. So if you switch your locale to Flemish, everything will just work. Like your number formatting will work, your date formatting will work, and your language formatting will work if you have the translation files. So that's a pretty big win for us. One of the problems we've had in the past is number formatting wouldn't internationalize automatically, language like text strings would. And so Jose made the executive decision to switch to Intel. And I think it was a really good idea because now we have internationalization everywhere. Another thing that came out is through the use of Composer, you have to kind of have separate repos for separate things. So we created an app skeleton, and it basically is the app directory of the old framework, but in a separate repo. And what this will let you do is more easily customize and fork it. And when you want to pull in changes, you don't have to worry about merge conflicts with the app directory or those types of issues. So that's kind of nice. It also gives us the ability to release them independently if we want in the future. So we can upgrade the app and add dependencies there or remove dependencies and not have to modify the framework. So getting into more of the detailed features, has anyone ever had a confusing experience trying to configure one of the classes? You don't know whether you have to use a property or a method or what the method name is? No? Nobody? It's just me? Okay. So then this probably won't be that great for you. What we ended up doing was there were a lot of different method names for configuring things. Some classes used properties, some classes used methods of various names. For Cake 3, we decided that that was a little bit silly. So all of the static classes use one method, it's called config. And all of the instance classes use one method, it's called config. They work the same everywhere. And that's how you configure things. If you need to do any runtime configuration, the method is called config. It lets you read and set configuration the same everywhere, which is kind of nice. The ORM was replaced. Both one of the most treasured and most disliked features of CakePHP has been the model layer. It's served us really well over the past 7 or 8 years. But it's time for it to move on. PHP has advanced quite a bit in the past year, and Jose Lorenzo will be giving a really great talk on what we've done, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. If you were at the workshops, you got to bathe in the executive power of the new ORM. The router has also been a performance bottleneck for a lot of applications in the past. And it also was somewhat verbose when you were connecting a lot of routes. So what we've done is we've left the old way of connecting routes and then added a new, what we call scope system. Similar to if you've used Rails, they have the namespace for routing. And what this does is it allows you to declare routes in a much more dry way. So if you have a common prefix, you can put that in the scope, and you don't have to redeclare it in each route. So one, it makes for less typing, and then it also allows you to partition your routes so that you can create a much faster parse tree. So on a large application, the one that, it's a big e-commerce site, I was able to get a 16 times performance increase on the route parse time. So the time it takes to take an incoming URL and figure out what controller to call, it went up by 16 times. We've also done a lot of work on fixing the reverse routing, because the reverse routing depends on arrays and a whole bunch of kind of computation to figure out whether or not a route matches or doesn't match. That can get kind of slow. And previously it was based on a linear search, so it would start at the top of your routes file and just try everything until it found one that worked. And the way it works now is we take the key parts of a route and figure out what the name would be. So if we had to boil that down, was it a controller action? Is it a wildcard action? Do we know the action name? Do we know the controller name? Is it a plugin or is it a prefix route? Like, we can take those 4 things and generate a list of possibilities of what the route might be, or where it might be in the route collections. And then we can search a much smaller subset of routes. So if you are careful with your routes, if your application is suffering from slow routing performance, and you're careful with your routes, you can actually get it down to basically a hash table lookup. So it goes from a linear search to a hash table, which is basically constant time. So going from ON to O1 is pretty reasonable, I think. I don't know how to make it go faster than O1. If you know how, I would love for you to tell me. Another thing that's got changed is the helper layer. We previously formatted HTML through arrays, and that had both some good things and some bad things. It was really flexible, but it was also really verbose, and it was also not the fastest thing in the world. So what we've done instead is, and then the templates that the data got formatted into were handled with sprintf. So if you didn't know, if you wanted to change the order of where things got formatted, you had to, is it 0 and then 1, and then how do I transpose them? And so that, for me at least, was painful. So we changed it. So we got rid of the sprintf and replaced it with like a very simple templating system that has no conditions. It's actually more logicless than Mustache. It has no logic. You can't loop. There's no conditions. It's just for formatting, basically. And what it lets you do is define like templates files. So if you have certain parts of your application that use different tag sets, you don't have to type all the arrays out every time. If you know that on every form you want the same class names to be on the div, you don't have to use input defaults in every single one of your views or use a before render hook to change that around. You can just configure the templates you want in one place, and then it will consistently use those templates everywhere. It also yields a little bit of a performance gain over the arrays, like mashing arrays together into strings to make HTML. And it doesn't use numbered replacements, it uses named replacements, and then all the names of the variables that are available in every template are in the documentation. The other thing that changed is the way that we handle the event subsystems. So in Cake 2.1, we added an events subsystem at the request, and it made a lot of sense at the time. However, we had to maintain compatibility with the callback style, so all the framework callbacks. This resulted in a lot of shim code, so we had to shim from an event into a callback, and that it worked, but it was a little bit weird. And then if you implemented custom callbacks, like custom events in your application, they worked differently than the core ones, and that was confusing. You had to know whether it was a core callback or your application callback, so that was kind of painful. So we basically scrapped all the old callback style and switched everything to just basic events. So the first argument of every event callback is the event, and then the positional arguments come afterwards. This means that it's much easier to stop a callback. So if you want to stop a framework callback, you just, instead of having to return false, you can call stop on the event, or you can return false. And so you basically have a much more consistent approach to handling events. Also, by removing the old shims around callbacks, we were able to speed it up quite a bit. So that was nice. The other thing we've done is get some outside help. Just going to need some water. In the past, CakePHP has sometimes been criticized for being a little bit insular and not making good use of the existing ecosystem. And I'm happy to announce that that is over. One of the reasons we did that is we wanted to make the install really easy. One of the big benefits, one of the reasons I started using CakePHP back when I started, was that I could download a zip file and get going. This is in the days of SVN before Git. So you could SVN check out the repo and it would work. And that for me is why I actually used it, because I tried to set up other frameworks and couldn't figure them out because I wasn't very smart at the time. So that's how I ended up on Cake. It's a funny story. And so one of the reasons we avoided dependencies is that we would have to merge them into our code tree, which can get kind of hairy with licensing. But through because we can use Composer now, what we can do is actually include dependencies, and when you create your application or install your application's dependencies, we can install ours at the same time, which works pretty well. So what did we use? We used Carbon for datetime improvements. Carbon's a library provided by, I think, Brian Nesbitt, I think is his name. And it basically gives you a lot of sugar on top of date times. And so we use that internally to do a bunch of datetime formatting. It's also nice for unit tests because you can fix time. You can set time to be static, which is kind of nice. So if you use Carbon, you can say it's 12 o'clock, and that's what time it is. And if you make a new time, that's what time you get. It's always noon. Because a lot of my pain from doing unit testing and integration testing is that time changes, and you can get fluctuations. You're off by a second here or off by a second there. And being able to just fix time solves a lot of like annoying time-based issues. Another thing we've used is Aura Intel. That's basically to replace our own PO parsing and MO file parsing. The funny thing about all that is there's this weird ancestry where the PO file and MO file parsing came from Cake, went to Lithium, went to Symfony, went to some other guy, and then we used the most modified version of that. We brought it back into Cake. So there's this weird ancestry that Jose found when we were looking through the code. That's kind of neat. That's one of the cool things about open source is you write some code, it ends up in 2 other frameworks, and then you kind of take the best parts of those, merge them together, and then you have newer code that someone else fixed for you. The other thing we've used is password compat. In the past, CakePHP has defaulted to SHA-1 hashing, and for Cake 3 we default to bcrypt, and we didn't want to write the bcrypt method ourselves. The crypt is already built into PHP, but you have to write a little bit of code around it to specify all the parameters for bcrypt. But one of the PHP core guys has written a backwards compatibility library for the password hash and password verify and password needs re-verify. And so we basically use that patch library to provide the functions you would get in PHP 5.5, but in PHP 5.4. And it's a really well-tested library that we don't have to worry about, so you can be sure that if you use password hashing in Cake, you're getting good, well-tested bcrypt hashes, which is quite nice. So while we did a lot of things and included a bunch of libraries, there's a few things we didn't do. And I think those are kind of interesting because there's often in the past there were discussions like, why don't you use X? Why don't you use Y? And so I'm going to talk about why we didn't do those things. So the first thing we didn't do was use Doctrine. When we set out to rewrite the ORM, it was very, very, very tempting. Jose and I looked at Doctrine, we read through the code, and we're like, we could almost just use Doctrine, like so close. And then we tried to figure out how we would migrate people from the existing ORM to Doctrine. The new ORM has a lot of conceptual, carries on a lot of the conceptual ideas from the old ORM in Cake, whereas Doctrine would have been a total divergence. And so we didn't go with Doctrine, partly because the documentation was not up to our standards, and we didn't know if we were going to be able to fix the documentation. And we also were thinking that it was going to be kind of a really terrible experience for people, where the Cake docs would be like, go look at Doctrine, and then they would probably never come back. So we thought about those kinds of things. Those are the kinds of things we thought about, like how do we provide good documentation, how do we provide good support for this code? Like if we make an ORM and we want to give it to a really large community, how do we provide good support? Like we don't have commit access to Doctrine, we can't just go up and say, yo, Benjamin, give me commit access. Like we have to work that through. And we weren't really sure that we were going to be able to make a good interface for it. We would have to write something on top of Doctrine, which means there'd be a layer, then Doctrine, then Doctrine's DBAL. And when we thought about it, we could probably write something very close. We could write exactly what we wanted with no shims and no compatibility layers and not have to deal with any support issues. We would control the whole thing. We would be able to write the documentation to the level that we wanted. So that's kind of why we didn't go with Doctrine. So no HttpFoundation, or HTTP kernel for that matter. We also looked at this. There was a long discussion in IRC and on mailing lists, and we thought about it, we really did. There were some really good things, and there were some not so good things as well. We decided that we could provide the 80% of the features that we wanted and that we thought people would use, with probably much less than 80% of the code. Again, it was one of those issues where how do we provide support, how do we provide documentation, how do we manage complexity. I'm a big proponent of use the simplest thing that works. You can kind of see that pragmatism in both the way Jose and I work. And this would have, using HttpFoundation and HTTP kernel would have solved a lot of problems, but it would have created another set of problems where we had a much more complex code base to manage, and you as developers, if you had an issue, you had a much more complex code base to work with. So that's why we didn't go that way. Ultimately, not using HTTP kernel and HttpFoundation meant we couldn't use the libraries provided by StackPHP. We talked to the authors of Stack in Buenos Aires, and it just wasn't going to happen. They are very tightly coupled to Symfony's components, and the only way we could leverage them was to use Symfony. So in order to get the benefits of StackPHP, you have to go all in on Symfony. You can't go, if you're a Zen framework or a Cake developer, I don't know, they promote it as a cross-platform thing, but it's only cross-platform if you're in the Symfony Kool-Aid pool. Again, that's something we couldn't commit to. So I'm sorry. I don't know if that makes you sad or if it makes you happy, but that's how that went down. So you're probably wondering how all these great new improvements perform. I've got mostly good news. These are tests I ran on my laptop, this laptop right here. Using Siege, I put the repo up. It's in my GitHub account. It's called CakePHP if you want to see the code I used. Basically, I ran bake. I barfed out a bunch of code. I turned debug off, put some records in a database, and ran some tests. So basically what we're seeing is that everything is better than Cake 2 except for a list of rows, like the index page. And from what we can tell, this comes down to internationalization. The new Intel code is a tiny bit slower than the old Intel code. The other thing is the ORM has a little bit more overhead because you're actually getting objects and you have a query builder, you have entities. That all adds a little bit of complexity. But I think it's worth it. The people in the workshop yesterday will probably agree that that extra little bit of overhead is probably worth the ability to cut your code by half or more. So again, we're making a runtime versus performance trade-off. We're also going to be, I think Jose and I both have some plans to do some serious profiling in the next couple weeks and figure out if there are anything that's obviously wrong that we can fix. But I'm happy to say that otherwise, performance is up. So that's good. So we've been able to add features and add a lot of cool things and not actually degrade performance horrifically. Like it hasn't cut in half, it hasn't cut in like a third. The green to yellow in the center is 130 requests to 97. So, it's 40 requests per second on a chunky laptop. Oh, and that's all using file cache as well. I didn't want to do anything fancy, so file cache. So, we're at an alpha 2. What's going to happen with beta? How are we going to do it? What's next? What happens to all the stable branches? So 3.0 beta is going to launch today. I just finished doing all the merges and all of that, so I'm just waiting for Travis to finish the CI. The release announcement's written, so maybe over lunch or during the first break, I'll probably be tagging the release and doing the release, so now you know. The plan going forward is that there's not going to be a ton of backwards compatibility breaks. If you were playing with the dev and alpha releases, you may have had some painful times, and we're sorry. We would delete entire subsystems and replace them. All the directories would just change. Those kinds of things are hopefully done with. We have one change left planned for the controller test case, so we want to make it more like a formal integration testing system. The current mock-based approach is valid, but it has a lot of complications and nuances that have a lot of sharp edges that are hard to deal with. So we figured that giving people a really good integration testing tool is going to be a lot more valuable than having a kind of flaky integration testing tool. Other than that, there's no planned large changes. So the hope is that after the beta, we'll have a fairly stable set of releases, and in like 4 months, we'll be ready to go. So we're planning on doing 2 betas and 2 RCs, unless you folks find tons of horrific show-stopping bugs. That's the plan. So I'm not going to commit to a date, because I do this in my free time, but that's the plan. So the other thing that we have to work on is the documentation. While it's currently accurate and up to date, there's a lot of like finessing that needs to be done. There's a lot of proofreading that needs to be done. And just, taking people who are confused in IRC, making those into documentation sections, finding out what's not clear to people and trying to make that clear so that people don't have to go in IRC or go on Stack Overflow and ask questions, that the documentation just has the questions that they want to know answered. There's also a couple features have been moved out of the core and into plugins, so migrations is no longer part of Cake core, but it is a plugin. We've got it started, it mostly works. Same with debug kit, I've been working on that this week, it's almost finished. The ACL infrastructure has been pulled out into a plugin, so if you don't need it, you don't have to pull it in. And we're going to be going towards a much more plugin-based approach for optional features. So there used to be a whole collection of features where people would want them, but we didn't want to put them into core because not everyone's going to need them. It didn't really fit the 80% use case. And so we're hoping that the community can get involved with plugins and build out all those optional features that some people need and not everyone needs, and get them all working. So if you have plugins that you maintain, it's going to be pretty straightforward to start upgrading them soon. To that end, we've started the debug kit, we've started the migrations, the ACL plugin is complete, and there's also an upgrade tool. The upgrade tool works most of the time. It still has a few rough edges. I think we're going to iron those out by using it and figuring out what doesn't work and what does work, and then patching it as we go. The goal for the upgrade tool is that most of the automated boring stuff will have shell tasks that you can use, much like the 1.3 to a 2.0 migration. So things that do work already is you can run a console script and it'll take all the app uses calls and convert them into namespace imports, rename all the classes, you can move all the files around, you can rename a bunch of methods, you can rename a bunch of protected properties. There's changes for the IATN formatter, so if you want to use the Intel format, you can switch all your sprintf formatted strings into the Intel formatted ones. You can also just keep the sprintf if you prefer that and don't want to make that change. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to look at. You can rewrite all your test fixtures because the internals, we support foreign keys and composite primary keys now. So those kinds of things work a lot better. So this all sounds great, but what about 2.x? We all have applications written in 2.x. We're all maintaining them. What's the deal? So I have good news. 2.6 is coming out. The current plan for 2.6 is, I think, September. What we're trying to do with the 2.x release is stay on a 6-month cycle. There'll probably be a 2.7. There may be a 2.8. That totally depends on you guys and the people on the internet, I guess. How many more 2.x releases we do really depends on the demand and the interest of the community. We'll continue to support and do bug fixes as long as it's probably required. To that end, we've supported 1.3 for almost 4.5 years. I think the first release of 1.3 came out in July of a long time ago. 1.3.20 came out last July. There's a couple patches on the 1.3 branch. So we're probably going to end support for 1.3 when 3.0 comes out. It will have almost lived a very long life of 5 years. That's a pretty long time for a framework. That's almost an operating system level of LTS. So some operating systems are only 4 years, and we did 5 on a framework. And we think we've done a good job on that, supporting it. You can probably expect similar levels of support for 2.x. We'll continue fixing bugs on the tip release for as long as people want them. We hadn't planned on doing 1.3 this long, but it's still being used by people, and it's still important. And people have businesses running on it, and I understand that because I work at a company. We have to support all kinds of crazy stuff, so I get it. Thankfully, 2.x is really easy to support, so we can continue doing bug fixes for as long as we need. So yeah, your code is safe with us. No. There's also plans for 3.x releases. Because we're getting close to a beta, we can build 3.0 forever, basically. We could never actually release it, and that's a common pitfall in software, is you have to decide at some point that it's done enough, we're going to ship it, and then we're going to do more stuff later. So what we're planning is similar to 2.x, where we did 6 to 8 month release cycles on feature branches. So every 6 to 8 months, we'll cut a new feature release, update the docs, do all that kind of stuff. And then every 2 weeks to every month, we'll do a bug fix release. That's kind of the cycle we've been going. This has resulted in, I think last year we did 58 releases or 54 releases last year. So it's going to be fun. Thankfully, we've automated all of our release processes, so the most difficult part for us to cut a release is to write a blog post. Yeah. So one of the other fun things that we're considering is that future releases may require new PHP. This doesn't mean PHP 7, because it doesn't exist, but what we are considering is that PHP has gone into a much faster release cadence, and we want people to be able to take advantage of those as quickly as possible. And also we want to be able to provide framework level tools to kind of improve on top of PHP's new features. So there is a possibility, we don't know because it's out in the future, that 3.2 or 3.3 might use PHP 5.6 or PHP 5.7. We don't know. But there is that we're not going to hold ourselves back. One of the good things with 2.0 was that we were super stable. There haven't been a ton of regressions between 2.0 and 2.5. Most code just works. Like you can take code from 4 years ago when we released 2.0 and just drop it in 2.5 and it works. One of the downsides to that is we've been super stable, and there's been an impression of stagnation, which is false. We've been shipping code every day for the past 5 years. But there's this weird perception that if you're not making leaps and bounds, that you're not making progress. So what we want to do is try and kind of massage that a little bit and be able to move forward with PHP and still maintain backwards compatibility. So we're going to try and make a more fair balance between backwards compatibility and cutting edge. We don't want to go to bleeding edge, but cutting edge is okay. So we'll figure that out, and that will involve discussion with the community as well. So how can you help? You're probably all wondering, wow, Mark, this sounds great. I want to help. Well, I have good news for you. It's very easy. You can give 3.0 a spin, find some issues. If you don't find any issues, that's great. If you find them, let us know. We would like to fix them before we make a stable release and have to do anything. One of the most important things to look at right now is kind of API design and the way that the classes are being used. Because once we go stable, we are very reluctant to change things because that causes backwards incompatibility, which means big version number changes. Another thing you can do is read the docs and find mistakes. It's pretty easy to do a pull request to the docs. You go on the page and click edit, it takes you into GitHub, forks the repo, opens up the code editor. You can just change it right on GitHub, click save, it opens a pull request, and then someone will merge it later on that day. You can look at open pull requests. There's a bunch open. There's probably not going to be as many new feature pull requests, but you can look at them, report on them. If you're having the same issues that are already open, propose ways to fix them. You can also propose ways to simplify your workflow. We've designed the framework, like the new tools in the framework, to simplify our workflows, and we think they're probably pretty common with your workflows. If they're not, we'd like to know. And if we think that, if there's a consensus that this workflow is worth building in, then we can go forward with that, and we'd love to have your help and feedback. So that's pretty much my whole spiel. I don't know if I have time left over, James? No, I'm done. So if you have any questions, you can catch me in the hall or catch me sitting around, catch me over a beer, and we can chat. You can also email me or talk to me on IRC. I'm on in the evenings of North America time. So thanks.